So we're going to now move to the presentation from Taiwo and Dr. Bukola, who are going to speak to the theme of fractionalization and our favorite theme, the Orange Union. So could Taiwo and Dr. Bukola please confirm that they're with us?
Yes, we're here.
Excellent.
We are here.
Okay, over to both of you.
Well, this is an encore presentation, updated with new material to speak to a case study using Nigeria in the context of how the Orange Union will be a model of governance. Right. I'm joined by my very able Dr. Bukola Adeniji, my co-presenter. Thank you very much, guys, and I appreciate this opportunity. I suppose before we can talk about modeling for good governance, I think we need to have agreement on what good governance is. There are many definitions that we found online, but I felt that the one that is most appropriate is that good governance is an approach to government that produces the outcomes that the citizens themselves desire. I don't think that it is my place to tell any group of people what good governance is. So it must be something that will produce the outcomes that they want. And inherent in this definition is that citizens themselves must be placed at the center of good governance. So I hope that there's agreement on that. And if we're going to model for good governance, I felt that it makes sense to look at the cross-country evidence. We have to examine the empirical evidence of countries that demonstrate what we sort of at least universally agree to be good governance. And what are some of those things that these countries demonstrate? Rule of law is one. Low corruption is another. By and large today, many more countries are governed by democratic systems that exhibit good governance. So I think we should look at that as well. So what we've done is we've gone across to look at a lot of indices that measure these tenets. The Rule of Law Index is a compendium of countries across the world measured according to the constraints on government powers. And this is very critical. We don't want runaway government, even though every citizen cannot be involved in government. We have to have representatives, but those representatives cannot just run away and just do anything they want. So we have to have constraints on their powers. So the Rule of Law Index measures that. It measures also absence of corruption, measures open government, the access that people have to their government, measures fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. Then we also looked at the Corruption Perception Index. Corruption is defined here as abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The CPI ranks countries by their perceived level of public sector corruption. So then we also looked at Democracy Index. This measures the electoral process and pluralism, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. Then we also found an index that actually measures good governance by itself. And this one measures government effectiveness, voice and accountability, rule of law, which was also looked at in more detail earlier on, control of corruption, regulatory quality, political stability, and absence of violence and terrorism. Then one other thing we looked at, and this one, you could say that in order for us to begin to solve a problem, you have to have some theories. So we did have some theory that the level of fractionalization may impact good governance. And by looking at this index, we're able to correlate the performance on the other indices with this one to see whether there's any pattern. So fractionalization is the probability that two individuals drawn randomly from a country's groups are not from the same group. It is a measure, it is an approximate measure of the similarity between languages, varying from 1, meaning that the population speaks 2 or more unrelated languages, to 0, meaning that the entire population speaks the same language. Obviously, there is no country with a perfect score of 0, meaning that they are extremely non-fractionalized. So most countries range between over 0 and under 1. So when we put together all of the indices and we ranked it by the good governance rank, we saw a correlation that all of the countries that are ranked highly on good governance also rank very highly on democracy index. They also rank very highly on the rule of law index. They rank very low on corruption. And we also saw that they were the lowest fractionalized countries. So what we did here is invariably we had about 200 countries across all the indices. And what we now did was to rank them by decile. We essentially divided the 200 countries by 10 to get the first decile ranking. So this is the first decile of that ranking. We see all of these countries: New Zealand, Norway, Switzerland, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Canada, Netherlands, Australia, Austria, Ireland, Singapore, Germany, Japan, Estonia, United Kingdom, Taiwan, Belgium, and Portugal. And what it did here to sort of bring home the point, because if all we did was just put the fractionalization indices here, the point may not be driven home. So what we've done also is we went ahead and looked at, in every country, we looked at the largest ethnic group and the percentage that they occupy. And this is an approximation. The percentage of the largest ethnic groups is an approximation for the fractionalization of that country. That means that the higher the percentage of the largest ethnic group, the lower the ethnic fractionalization. And so we also listed the regime type based on the democracy rank. And so what we have here, as you can see here, is every single country in the top decile, they have the largest ethnic group being more than 50% of the population. So if you look at the definition of fractionalization, it is the probability that two individuals drawn randomly from the country's groups are not from the same ethnic group. So necessarily, when you have the largest ethnic group occupying more than 50% or comprising more than 50% of the population, then obviously there's a very high likelihood that when you draw two random people from that population, you're going to get 50% more, or at least approximately according to the size of the largest ethnic group, you're going to get the chance that you get two people that speak the same language is higher, where the largest ethnic group is more than 50%. So the proxy, obviously, for fractionalization is also the percentage of the largest ethnic group. This is very compelling. And Africa didn't rank. No African country ranked in the first decile. So I went ahead and looked to include the deciles where we have some African countries. So we had these four countries in the second and the third decile of the ranking, which isn't too bad. I mean, if you're ranking countries, we're supposed to have a sort of distribution. But what we have here also is that these countries also demonstrate that they have low fractionalization. In Mauritius, the largest ethnic group there occupies 66% of the population. In Botswana, the Tswana group occupies 79% of the population, or comprise 79% of the population. In Cape Verde, you have the largest ethnocultural group there being 71% of the population, and Seychelles, 93%. We also looked at something called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income distribution across a population. It serves as a gauge of economic inequality. It measures income distribution, or less commonly, wealth distribution amongst a population. The coefficient ranges from 0 or 0% to 1 or 100%, with 0 representing perfect equality and one representing perfect inequality. So obviously, the closer the value of Gini coefficient is to 0, the more equal that society. And so what did we find? We also found that the countries that are ranked the highest, or in this case, the top decile, also have very low Gini coefficient. And these same countries, except one, Timor-Leste, all of these countries also have very low fractionalization, and they have majority. Each of them has a majority agricultural group, as we can see here. And we have some African countries here that also demonstrate the same pattern. The more equal a society is, there's also a very likelihood that there's a dominant ethnic group in that society. In the case of Sudan, even though its largest ethnic group is only 35%, it's sort of like an exception to the rule. In this case, it does have a very low Gini coefficient, but in this case, it doesn't mean that the people there are rich. It just simply means that they have similar equality in terms of their wealth. So it could be that everybody is poor as well. So who is responsible for good governance? Clearly, if we look at the history of all of these countries, their histories are quite different, but there's always at the beginning a group of leaders, visionary leaders, that have come together to establish a political system that serves good governance. And clearly, these models, these political systems that are established, they tend to work very well when there's a large dominant ethno-cultural group in that country, bar none. And so this is very telling. This is cross-country evidence that we should take to heart and as a guide in how we try to solve the problem that we confront in Nigeria and every other African country that has a problem. Obviously, as we defined good governance initially, the inherent definition puts citizens in the center. So we have to make sure that the citizens themselves, by virtue of the fact that they are very similar, they speak similar languages, which we see shows a pattern for consensus building. That will be required because consensus is what's required. The ability to agree and to protest bad leadership is required to hold politicians accountable. And so these politicians also are necessary because everybody cannot serve in government, so we have to have representatives. But by and large, the citizens are the center of all of the countries that we find to have good governance. Let me turn it over to my able presenter, Dr. Bukola, to take the last few slides and talk about the case in comparing Nigeria and some other countries and why the Orange Union has a very veritable model for us. Dr. Adeniji, over to you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, hello, everyone. So I'm just going to move through our slide pretty quickly. Mr. Ayedun has laid the foundation of good governance. And how does good governance now translate into what the nation is supposed to be? So there are additional things that we found that should be present in a nation for it to be successful. Just a little bit of clarification: nation versus a state. A nation is a group of people that are bounded by their culture, language, traditions, and everything. They may or may not have a country of its own, as in the case of the many nations that are within Nigeria, whereas a state is a geographic space, just like we know, that may include nation. In the case of Nigeria, I'm going to use the term interchangeably. Nigeria essentially is a nation state, but the nation within Nigeria are not recognized, and that is by design. So I'm going to go on now to the next slide that talk about what should be in a nation for it to be successful in the anatomy of a nation. So we look at the book Nation Building by Andreas Wimmer, and three essential things were mentioned there. And this is based on what has been found in nations that has been successful. So we talk about voluntary nations or organization, and Switzerland, which one of our speakers already talked about today, was actually a model for that. Also, most successful nation, they found that they have this, another characteristic of a successful nation is central public good provision. And also the third one is linguistic integration. So these three main things, when they look at several data, they were able to come up with these three factors as the driving force in which nations that has been very organized and stable are built on. And it's very important to mention that nation building is a slow process. It takes generation to build a successful nation. Just like Mr. Ayedun just mentioned when he was talking about sovereignties and things like that. You see how many years it took the nations of the world that practice democracy to get to where they are. So we will go on now and just, so I'm going to start with the voluntary nation building and organization. This is exemplified very well in Switzerland. So the foundation of Switzerland was really based on the voluntary organizations that comes together. So prior to the founding of the country, there were several organizations that were already cut across all the different ethnic groups there. And when it's time for them to form the nation, it was easy for them to build on this foundation. This helped the nation to be successful and not divided along ethnic lines. So when you look at Nigeria, that doesn't exist. There are no existing institution or organization that stand the test of time, if you look at the whole nation state of Nigeria. But when you look at the regions, you can at least find some institution, you can at least find some organization that actually are well built, which is perhaps the reason why Nigeria has functioned effectively when it was in the region, compared to when it becomes a unitary government that disregards the existing structures. So Switzerland, as we like to refer to, this was the reason why they found that these voluntary organizations that already existed over the years was actually the main reason why the nation itself actually functioned effectively. If you compare that to Belgium, on the other hand, Belgium was not as successful because they have internal colonization, just like we are having now in Nigeria. And as a result of that, they become unstable to the point that they may eventually split along linguistic lines. So that's the one factor. So I'm going to go on to the next factor, which is this provision of public goods. And Botswana was used as an example of where a country where central public good provision has been effective. If we compare this to Nigeria, Botswana, they had this institution of what I essentially maybe call like the cattle pathway or whatever. So it was a national initiative. It helped them at the foundation of the country to be very effective to bring the ethnic groups together. But can you imagine that kind of a thing happening in Nigeria? It cannot. The reason is because Botswana was successful because it has a large, it has a clear dominant group, which was the Swana group that made up about 75 or 77% of they are the largest ethnic group there. And also they have a common culture. They have this cattle rearing culture. So introducing of a policy like the cattle pathway or whatever, it was not a problem, actually. It was something that is well accepted by all the different people because they have similar culture. In case of Nigeria, that cannot happen. So initiatives like Ruga, while you might call it a central public good, is only going to be beneficial to the northern part of Nigeria. I don't want them to Ruga my region, so it's not going to happen. That's where issues like when you think about, so it creates a situation whereby you have political inequality in the country. To solve that problem, an initiative like the Orange Union Group, that clearly will give us borders that will allow us to actually institute regional public goods that will increase the stability of the different regions. And contrary to many people's opinion, modernization, attempts like all of these things that we like to talk about jobs, technology, and all of that, they don't really translate to stable government. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to mention the third point, which is the linguistic integration. China was used as an example of linguistic integration. Unfortunately, that cannot happen in Nigeria. That's not the slide you're showing, but I'm just going to talk about it. That's the third point. So that's not going to happen in Nigeria. It's not going to happen because of the North is Arabic, the South is Western, so to say. There is no uniformity of identity there. So when you look at all of these factors, Nigeria is not going to be successful when you look at that. And of course, when you look at the different ethnic fractionalization was perhaps the biggest role. This is like an example of how fractionalized Nigeria is in terms of the major ethnic groups that are in Nigeria. So it's a Tower of Babel, pretty much, essentially. And I think, you know, when I had a slide that compared Nigeria together with Botswana, but I'm not even going to talk about that. I think the summary of it all is that when you look at the summary of the ethnic fractionalization and what it does, you will know that you cannot achieve success in a country that is largely ethnically fractionalized like Nigeria. The higher the ethnic fractionalization, the lower the GDP of a country. The higher the ethnic fractionalization, the lower the democracy index of a country. So you cannot even have democracy, a true democracy in a country like Nigeria. And what is going to result is issues like Donald Trump case, whereby you have a demagogue just come into place, capitalize on the ethnic division, and create chaos. And as a result of that, to solve that problem, you know, considering a model like the Orange model, we allow individual blocks to be able to participate directly in their government through ratification of their legislation from their local representative, and also build consensus that allows them to control their territories. I think we can round up there because I see that she has red, she issued a red flag for us. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, both Taiwo and Dr. Bukola, for that very clear, lucid presentation on the issues. And truly, with the Orange Union, you would then have within each segment, you would have that low level of fractionalization. I always struggle to get my tongue around that. But within each segment of the Orange, you would have that higher level of common language, shared history, shared values, such that you're neutralizing the internal ethnic conflict, which is what is pinning us down right now.